Okay, so one of the things that I've found with HackMotion is obviously it's fantastic for the full swing, but it's very, very illuminating when we start looking at short game patterns, different shots around the green, putting and chipping. Absolutely fantastic for picking out very small, almost imperceptible movements, especially when we start talking about contact problems with chipping and pitching in particular. We see some micro movements in the planes of motion. So basically, today's presentation is more about kind of how I would work with HackMotion with all groups of players, from beginning golfers all the way down to tour professionals, and some of the things that I see. So one of the first things that I generally want to know is I want to have some important sort of questions I'm going to ask, or what everyone should be asking themselves, I'm sorry, before they hit a short game shot. So number one, what does this shot really require? What is the trajectory? What is the carry versus roll? Am I trying to spin the ball or not spin the ball? What am I actually looking for on this particular shot? After we determine that, how do we manipulate the technique and setup to obviously create the desired shot? How is the lie? And we start talking about great short game players versus good short game players. I really think that great short game players do a better job assessing the lie and sort of understand what they can and cannot do out of that particular lie. And that's sort of a question we have to ask ourselves. I might need a high flop shot, but if I'm on bare hardpan, I might have a difficult time, obviously, trying to create that type of a shot. A big one that I teach a lot of is what part of the wedge are you using to primarily interact with the turf? Am I trying to hit the turf with the lead edge, the sole, or the trail edge? Different techniques, different wrist options are going to allow me to facilitate that lead edge, sole, or trail. How do you manage the club face vector? Where is the club face pointing in space? How am I delivering that to the golf ball? Am I de-lofting and rotating the club face vector? Am I adding loft and opening the club face vector? What part of the club face are you trying to strike? So in the short game, you've got some advantages when you start to use different parts of the club face to create different smash factors. So smash factor is something that I really have done a lot of research on in the short game. And for example, on a standard chip or a pitch, you're going to see somewhere around a 0.9 to 1 smash factor between club speed and ball speed. But if I start to strike that out toward the toe of the club, like Tiger Woods typically hits a lot of flop shots out on the toe. You can get that smash factor down to about 0.55 or so relative to the club head speed. So what that means is I can swing hard, get the club through the grass, and actually have it still come off the club very dead, very soft. Okay, if we understand how to use that different parts of the club face. One of the questions from a teacher standpoint is, does that player like to use one technique around the green and then alter the club and the setup? Or are they going to learn a bunch of different release styles? When I'm dealing with all levels of players, what's the player's common strike miss? Are we more likely to hit it heavy or thin? Because a lot of times we can see those micro movements, as I said, at the wrist level. And lastly, I want to know what their equipment, either their equipment is helping them or hurting them in terms of their lie and loft and bounce and grind on the wedge. That can either help our technique or hurt it. If you've got a fairly versatile wedge setup, you can play a bunch of different shots. If you go heavily with either a ton of bounce and or not enough bounce, there's certain shots that you're certainly going to find a little bit more difficult. So generally on tour, you see a lot of wedges that have some versatility built into the grind and the sole. A lot of our amateurs require more bounce because their technique isn't so good, and that kind of helps them slide that bounce against the turf and perhaps avoid the heavy strike. So the first shot we're going to kind of look at a little bit here, and I kind of went through and I demonstrated, I think there's 7 or 9, I think, shots here we're going to go through and just understand a little bit of what's going on. And for those of you who've been watching all day, we start to look at those different movements in the lead wrist, we have obviously our extension and flexion in the lead wrist. We have our radial and ulnar deviation in the lead wrist, as well as some supination, pronation, or what we like to call at HackMotion, the global rotation, which is also the body rotation and the fact your trail arm bends, etc. So the funny thing is, when I started to do some investigation on this, this is where I was quite interested, because what I felt I was doing and what I was actually doing were quite a little bit different. So, for example, in this classic sort of bump and run style shot, ball was back in my stance. I was pushing that lead wrist toward flexion in the backswing, which was de-lofting the face and creating negative bounce. And I could swear to you that I was simply holding that and rotating that whole action through the golf ball. And certainly I was rotating it through, as you can see, but you can see that as I approached impact, I actually let out a little bit of that flexion, okay? And I could swear to you I was not doing that at all. So the intent was not to certainly allow that movement back toward extension, but in fact, you know, the mass of the club and the way that we're sort of bringing this down into the turf was actually causing that wrist to move a little bit back toward extension. Now, having said that, the wrist is still in flexion as I strike the turf, or I strike the golf ball here, but it was very interesting because it was opposite to what I thought. On this shot, we sort of have a long arc finish, if we want to call it that, and sort of a stable flexion and ulnar rehinge. So there's not a lot of overtaking in this shot. That's why the blue line and the green line here are both sort of flatlining a little bit here. And we see the sort of extended finish there. The purple continues to rotate because my body continues to rotate around to finish. Now, when we kind of brought that into sort of a mid-high pitch, sort of a 25, 30 yard kind of mid-high pitch here with a 60-degree wedge, I've got that ball position a little bit more mid. I'm purposely trying to retain the extension in my lead wrist as I go back. As I do that, so there's a little bit more rotation. You can see the rotationary value is a little bit higher, but I'm maintaining that extension amount to the top of the backstroke. Okay, and again, I could swear to you that at impact, I was still cuppy, I was still extended. But when we look at the graph, I was subconsciously pushing the wrist slightly toward a little bit more flex state. Now, it was still technically extension, but it was less into extension than I would have imagined, basically. And then as I came through, you can see both the blue and the green, so that's the radial and ulnar, as well as the extension value, kind of moving back up, okay? And that's why we see an overtaking of the club head, okay? So you see the club head kind of makes that classic L shape later on the follow-through side, okay? So when we look at the high flop mechanics, okay, we just took that and we kind of extended that even a little bit more, okay, and we see that here I've got the ball position more forward. I'm actually extending the wrist even more, so I'm adding extension into the wrist as I get to the top of the swing. And then again, I think I'm not going back toward flexion, but I am down to impact. It's still extended at impact. But then we see a much quicker rehinge or a much quicker movement back toward extension in the radial and the lead wrist extension plane, okay? And this is allowing me to obviously create maximum bounce, create a trail edge contact here with the turf. So by the way, sorry, that's the way I kind of teach things. So that first shot, the bump and run, I'm hitting the turf more with the lead edge. The mid-high pitch, I'm learning to hit the turf with the sole. And this one, I'm certainly hitting toward the back edge or the flange. Now, where it gets a little bit interesting here, so then I started to throw in some variations. So this is a shot that I teach a lot of my players, and this is a shot that I use a lot myself. And this is a reverse overlap putting grip, what I like to call the poor man's flop shot. Because it creates a very soft, very high shot without a lot of risk here. So you can see that there's overall a lot less wrist movement in general in that lead wrist. My wrist is basically stable all the way back, maybe moving slightly toward flexion around P6, last parallel. And then I'm kind of kicking that wrist a little bit into extension as I'm hitting the ball, perhaps. Again, I don't feel like I'm doing this. I feel like I'm making, to be honest with you, a giant putting stroke. And as a child, this is a shot that I played a lot around the greens with a lot of success. That is sort of my go-to anytime I've missed a green. I need a nice, high, soft shot that's very repeatable. And by using my pivot to control the speed of the club a little bit more as opposed to the angular motion of the wrist, I find that my distance control shot to shot is a little bit easier with this. Now, I'll often combine this with the putting grip or the poor man's flop shot. I'll put that a little bit out on the toe to deaden it. And then I'm just going to rock that pivot back and forth. So when we put it off the toe, I said we reduce that smash factor. For a lot of players, this feels safer to them. And it works really nice, especially in the rough, especially off a reasonably sort of cushy lie. When we start to get into a much, much tighter lie, you have to cut the ball much more, cut across the golf ball a little bit more with the same technique. Because this is a bit shallow at the bottom of the arc. So by cutting across the golf ball a little bit, you squeeze the bounce of the club into the turf a little bit more, and you're able to move the contact point up onto the face, the vertical strike point up on the face a little bit more, okay? When we look at that rehinge rate, though, it's quite interesting. We see that, there's not a lot of sort of flipping it or re-hinging coming after impact. It's actually quite mild. Again, my feel with this shot is it feels like a gigantic putting stroke. Now, from there, I started to look at this and say, okay, well, first of all, my hairline's really bad, so I'm going to put my hat back on. That's the first thing I'm going to do. But I wanted to look at what the mechanics were for a 9,000 RPM low spinner from 50 yards. So here we're talking about a launch window between 25 and 30 degrees. We're talking about, I said, a spin rate that's 9,000 plus. And how would we create this shot reasonably consistently? Okay, and there's a couple interesting things here. First of all, when we look at the lead wrist here, we see fairly flat motion in the extension flexion plane, moving slightly toward more flexion at impact. The interesting thing is actually the purple value. So the purple value here is rotation. And this is one shot where you're actually turning down the loft a little bit more by supinating this a little bit onto the positive side of the zero graph here. Okay, that means I've turned this down a little bit more. And that complements the fact that as you push your wrist into flexion, when you look at the radial bone that sits on the top of your forearm here, if I just push my wrist toward flexion, that de-lofts the club, but actually opens the face. So when you go extreme with this value, you actually need a little bit more supination so that the face is now back to square. So players that turn the loft down like this, you'll see on HackMotion, you'll see that purple graph go a little bit into the positive as the lead wrist pushes more into flexion at impact. Okay. It's fairly stable rehinge here. It's not a quick rehinge, just a gradual rehinge. The interesting thing here, or what creates this, or I think for players when I teach this shot, is you need very soft knees and you need the pressure to be as far out on that left side of that foot into the finish as you can. Because with soft knees, what you're actually doing is you're helping to preserve the D-loft. You're helping to preserve that dynamic loft reduction, which is going to allow us to create that sort of 25 to 30 degree launch window that we need to create this particular shot. It helps I found if you hit this a little bit in toward the heel, a little bit low on the face, is generally where I try and hit this shot to try and maximize the spin rate. Wedge design is massive on this particular shot. If the CG of the wedge, center of gravity of the wedge is too low, it's very difficult to hit a 50-yard shot with over 9,000 spin. The CG is a little bit higher in the wedge, or you've got a bounce and grind on the bottom that makes the CG play a little bit higher. It's a little bit easier to get a lower face contact and increase that spin rate. But from a technique standpoint, it's quite interesting because there's a little bit of that turn down, more flexion with a little bit of an added supination at impact. So then we got some fun shots here. The last few are some fun shots I like to play around, not necessarily on the golf course, but we've got our Abraham Answer sort of 30-yard chop spinner. He's phenomenal at this shot. From 20 or 30 yards, you're producing somewhere around 7,500 RPM spin when you do this well. So the interesting thing about this little chop shot is you're going to stand a little bit further away from the golf ball. You're going to put the toe of the club up in the air a little bit so the heel is down. And what that does is that angles your spin axes left, okay, and allows you to de-loft this the most. Now, to combat that spin axis that's starting angled to the left, you need to cut across this ball quite substantially, okay, at least 12, maybe even 15 degrees across the golf ball. And then you can kind of create a very neutral spin axis by cutting across it so severely. And to a certain extent, it almost feels like the ball gets trapped on the face a little bit, okay? And we create this very high spin shot. So the interesting thing about this one is we look at the extension and flexion points, and they're quite stable, not really anything surprising, except that the wrist stays in flexion through impact and into the finish. But the real magic to this shot is in the radial ulnar. There's a lot more abrupt cocking of the club, obviously followed by a very steep, sharp ulnar motion into the back of the golf ball here. So here we don't have really any overtaking rate in the radial and extension planes at all. In fact, if anything, I'm trying to hold it off as I pound the ground here. So very interesting little shot, fun one to try and play. When we look at Seve Ballesteros 7-finger shot here, okay, so Seve would play this, kind of put the grip into the left pocket idea coming through the shot by letting go of the club with his last 3 fingers of his left hand as he approached impact. And this is an interesting one because I'm cutting this one, and I was quite surprised to see when I played this shot, I was actually pushing the wrist a little bit toward flexion before, as I came down and let go with those last 3 fingers, I was actually pushing the wrist quite dramatically toward extension. So here you can see a little bit different motion here with the release. You see that the extension amount goes massively into the positive, okay, at impact. At the same time, I'm actually holding the lead forearm quite a bit open, okay? That's why this kind of crosses the 0 line just a little bit below 0, and I'm sort of dumping the wrist as I let go with those fingers, okay? But here we have a massive, massive overtaking rate in the radial and extension planes, and we get this very flippy, very soft little play around the green. Okay, so I encourage you to play around with that one. That one's fun. We got 2 more here. Okay, then we got the Recoil Flop, and this one's fun. You can play this one a lot in the rough and so on. I'll find that a lot of players will use this in the US Open when you're barely missing the green and you're just trying to get the club, or the ball, I'm sorry, onto the green very, very softly. And here, this one's really interesting because you can see how I'm taking a pretty big swing at this and then literally stopping my left hand very abruptly before impact, which is causing the extension amount to increase quickly and slide that club underneath the ball very rapidly. Now, I'm pulling the club back is simply a counter movement for me stopping that lead arm so quickly. This technique works beautifully in the bunker, and a plug lie is one that I'll use this a lot. But you can use it around the greens, and in this case, this was kind of a bit of a fun little trick shot here. The key here is be very brisk. So the harder you sort of recoil, the more you kind of throw that club head under the bus and allow this sort of quick friction to barely even touch the golf ball here. So kind of a fun shot. And the last one, somebody asked me this morning if I was going to include the Ishikawa 3000. So here it is. So in 2012 at the Canadian Open at Hamilton Golf Country Club, my home track, my player on tour, Mackenzie Hughes, played with Ishikawa in a practice round on Tuesday. And Ishikawa starts pulling out these split-handed shots around the greens out of the heavy rough. And I'd never seen anybody do it before. And he was playing a little bit more conventional with the left-hand placement. And over the years, and as I did a lot of my certified coach camps and so on, I learned that I could make this even more effective if I flipped my left hand up and over. So this one's kind of funky because you can see how the graphs make no sense. Because I flipped over my left hand here, you see that the extension and flexion part of the graph is actually very stable. It really doesn't change all that much. But because the motion is this way, I'm moving it from radial deviation towards ulnar deviation very rapidly. That's that big drop in the blue line that you see there. And, you know, that motion, and in fact, this wedge only has about 8 degrees bounce, but I have to play it off my back toe because if I play it forward, there's so much flange and bounce being presented to the ball. It's very difficult not to scull this a little bit. So I've actually played this a little bit back to my stance. But if I had a 4-degree 60 M grind Vokey or something like that with 4 degrees bounce on it, I could probably put that up on my stance and make it go nowhere. But kind of a fun shot. I've yet to pull this one out in competition, but it's a fun one to pull out in my coaching camps for sure. All right. Any questions at all about any of those things here? I'm not sure. Can you hear me and see me okay?
Yes. Thanks a lot. That was really great. A lot of interesting patterns. And maybe the first question would be, let's say a coach has HackMotion and he has listened to your presentation, watched it now, and how would you recommend him to integrate this new knowledge in his coaching?
Well, what I would look at is basically those first 3 patterns that we sort of utilized was sort of what I call the dig, the skim, and the flop. And basically, you know, that bump and run where the ball is back in the stance and we're using that lead edge and pushing the wrist toward flexion to create more negative bounce, create that sort of bump and run style shot that's going to loft the ball low and so on off my back foot. What that looks like and what that looks like at the graph level. Now, what we see with a lot of amateur players is even though I was releasing the club, what I thought I was keeping it in flexion, it was actually releasing slightly this way at impact. But what we see at the amateur level
By
is
the way, Scott, since you have the presentation on, people don't see your camera. So if you're showing something, then unfortunately we can't see it.
Yeah, no problem.
Mm-hmm.
Here we go. Am I on now?
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Sorry. So what I was saying there is generally what we see with players, if we can get them to understand a little bit of those basic wrist motions for that bump and run and say, okay, well, we're going to try and push this wrist a little bit toward flexion. We're going to feel like we hold it, even though we understand that some of it's likely going to come out at impact. That for most of our amateur players is going to allow them to hit it crisply around the greens with reasonable contact. As the shots get a little bit more advanced and we start to have players actually working the club a little bit back toward extension, there's a timing involved. There's controlling the height of your body, controlling the radius of your arms and the swing to be able to make very precise contact. And that's a little bit harder for your average golfer. So generally I would work them from that bump and run shot into the mid pitch, into the flop, give them those 3 sort of basics where they move the ball position around. They understand slight difference in the wrist movement, because distinctly, if I'm trying to play a flop shot and I push the wrist toward flexion, that's probably not a very good way of doing that. Generally, when you're trying to hit that higher soft shot, I like to teach players to have a little bit more extension in that lead wrist, but add a little bit of supination, because that little bit of supination actually allows the bounce of the club, the bounce of the wedge to be utilized a little bit better and slide on the turf. Because most amateurs, fear the chunk, fear the fat hit on their chips and pitches. So when you start to get too much lead edge and they're trying to hit the ball high at the same time, usually that's a bit of a disaster.
Mm-hmm. All right. So Question from Nick. Do you expect similar graph patterns with different grip styles, weak versus strong grip in wedge play?
Great question. Generally what I advocate is I usually have my players be a little bit weaker in the short game than their full swing. So I usually teach 2, if not 3 different golf grips to my players. Around the greens, generally a little bit weaker is going to allow us to sort of expose that bounce a little bit more effectively. That player that comes to with a very, very, very strong rotated grip and then adds even a little tiny bit of flexion has so much lead edge in play that it's going to be very difficult to hit a shot high or to sort of skim the club across the ground. So generally I would say you want, let's say, neutral to slightly weak on the short game.
Mm-hmm. And then there's a question about how do you create very low flight, high spinner with an open face lob wedge?
Well, the key with that shot is, that's almost, your Thai spinner. I know I've got a few of my my certified coaches from Thailand watching right now. And that's a shot that they play quite a bit in Thailand, and they open the face. And it's kind of like the Abraham answer, but they're doing it with an open face, and they get so steep on it, almost, they're almost hitting it right off the bottom groove, if you will, which takes a lot of skill to do that. But they'll lay that face open, get very, very steep on it, and just catch it very much on the very low part of that golf club. So it's a little harder to play it that way, but certainly there are lots of players that can pull that one off.
Mm-hmm. And there's a question about what pattern do you typically see with a standard bunker shot?
Great question. Typically a bunker shot, which I didn't throw into the presentation here, but you're going to see is more like the mid-high pitch or lob shot, where you're going to see the wrist push toward extension. Because the more I push the wrist toward extension and add supination, the more bounce I'm adding to the bottom of the club. So as I extend, as I supinate at the same time in the backstroke, you're exposing more and more bounce to the sand. So thick lie in the rough, thick lie in the sand trap, those are all going to be effective places to utilize that type of a technique. If I've got a shot in a divot or a very tight lie or burnt out lie, pushing the wrist a little bit more toward flexion to reduce the amount of bounce that's exposed is probably a better option. So, and that's why generally you'll see low bounce wedges being used in West Texas and at St. Andrews, and higher bounce wedges in Hawaii and places that have soft sand and so on. Is generally the conditions are going to dictate a lot of what you can and cannot do.
Mm-hmm. Question about what technique would you recommend for hardpan?
I would generally do some variation of it depends on what I'm really trying to do, but something like maybe a softer version of that Abraham answer chop there, where the ball's a little bit back in the stance. We're going to push that wrist a little bit maybe toward flexion just to reduce, right? So if extension and supination adds bounce, okay, flexion and not supinating as much is going to reduce bounce. So if I add a little bit of flexion, but take it a little bit across the golf ball, because when you cut across it, you're squeezing that bounce effectively into the turf and reducing it even further. So on tight lies, you want to cut the ball more, but I might actually push the wrist a little bit toward flexion as I do that to try and get rid of the bounce on the bottom of the wedge.
Mm-hmm. On the bump and run, would it not be better to loft down instead of putting ball back and changing wrist angles and using leading edge?
I'm sorry, to which?
Bump and run, would it not be better to loft down instead of putting ball back and changing wrist angles and using leading edge?
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. So use an 8-iron or a 9-iron or something like that. Absolutely. I mean, no problem with any of that. It just depends on the player. I mean, it depends on the conditions you play. I find that, over here in certainly North America, a lot of times in the summertime, the greens are firm and fast, usually running somewhere around 11 on the stimp meter. So if you try and chip a bump and run with an 8-iron, very difficult to control, especially with today's irons, which have very hot faces. So it's very difficult to control how hard that ball comes off the face. So sometimes using a wedge, which is going to come off a little bit softer, or playing a little bit off on the toe where it's going to come off a little bit softer, is a good option. But certainly that technique you can utilize, whether it's a lob wedge or an 8-iron.
Mm-hmm. Okay, question about what would you recommend for playing a 40 to 50 yard bunker shot?
Number one, your core strategy is very poor because you shouldn't leave yourself that shot. Number two, generally I'll use a 9-iron, probably a pitching wedge or a 9-iron from 50 yards. Play it like a standard bunker technique, but just change clubs. I've hit that shot with even an 8-iron before. It's just easier to make it go that far, still hit the sand, still play it like a standard bunker shot. But because you've got the extra length on the shaft, as well as obviously a lot less loft, it's a lot easier to make that ball go 40 or 50 yards. Where it gets very difficult is obviously if you've got to fly another bunker or some sort of a trouble before you get to the green. Now you're taking on a huge risk to try and pull that shot off successfully with a sand wedge or a lob wedge. You might have to try and obviously half strike the golf ball at least and not really play it like a standard bunker shot. But as long as I've got enough room between myself and the pin, the safest option there is probably an 8 or 9 iron as a standard bunker shot.
Mm-hmm. All right. What if a player adds speed to try to add spin, is actually doing the opposite? Is that too much smash?
Well, great question. Okay. And that's something when I go through my certification with the coaches is when I talk about short game, I call them softeners. Okay. So, instead of looking at it and trying to create maximum height or maximum spin by adding velocity, in reality, a lot of times around the green, it's not velocity that you need. You really just need that ball to kind of leak off the club face and land very, very, very softly. So it doesn't need to go miles up in the air, and it doesn't need to have a whole lot of spin on it. Now, if I've got to go over a tree that's in front of me, well, that's another story. But there is sort of that correlation that if I swing very hard, this is why generally your success level as you swing harder on flop shots, your distance control becomes very poor. That's why that poor man's flop shot with the putter grip is very safe, because the ball doesn't go as high, but it comes off very soft. And that's really what I'm looking for. And I can play that shot 10 times in a row and have that ball come off in a very consistent fashion. But when you start to add speed to the equation, not only are you changing necessarily the spin rate, but you're also changing where on the face you're hitting the ball quite a bit because of that speed. Sometimes you might catch it high in the face, you might catch it low in the face. That's going to change the spin, that's going to change the launch, and certainly it's going to change your distance control. So unless it's a last resort, I don't like players to ever, play their flop shots with an insane amount of speed for that reason.
Mm-hmm. All right. Then there's a question, do you find correlations in how ulnar the wrist is dependent on the release pattern?
I think you mean that setup is what I think they're talking about, perhaps, is maybe, some of the chipping styles will sort of push the wrist a little bit toward ulnar deviation at setup. And that tends to lock out the wrist a little bit and doesn't allow the wrist to change movement as much when we sort of lock it in that plane. So a lot of players who putt will sort of arch the wrist a little bit into ulnar to sort of lock that up. A lot of times you'll play that a little bit, especially in Florida. On Bermuda grass, you probably play it out on the toe of the club, lift the heel of the club out of the grass, go a little bit ulnar deviated, and kind of just bump it with a little putting stroke. So generally that technique, which I didn't cover there, but is a very valid technique for a lot of situations where the grass is very grainy, very sticky, and the heel tends to grab.
All right. One question is about specifically about video. What loft were you using in your videos?
I took all those swings with my 60 degree.
60 degree. All right. Then there's a question about how do you prefer your players to hit their buried bunker shot, open or closed face?
Depends on how much green I have to work with. So if the the pin's on the other side of the green, I've got lots of green to work with. And there's not a very high lip, I'll probably get them to play it closed and kind of, toe the club in a little bit, leave the club in the sand, and it'll come out with not a lot of spin. It'll run across the green quite easily. If they've got a short bunker shot, maybe a higher lip, then I'll play the recoil shot that we showed there, where I'll open the face, get very steep on it, very cut across it a little bit, but actually swing very hard and recoil the club out of the sand. And that way I can create a little bit more softness, a little bit more height. I know some of my friends over in Europe like to play, I think it's Pablo Larrazabal's shot or whatever it is, or Pablo Martinez, one of those guys. They'll open the face 90 degrees and come over the top and bury it this way. And I don't quite have that shot. But anyways, there's a couple different ways to play that plug lie shot, but usually closed if I've got green and a low lip, and recoil if I've got a high lip or a short shot.
All right. Then there's a question about what are your thoughts on cross-handed chipping drill?
You know what? In South Africa, they actually teach a lot of players to teach cross-handed chipping all the time. There's some distinct advantages with cross-handed because it's a little easier cross-handed to keep deflection amounts into impact, especially on a standard little bump and run shot. So for a lot of the little shots around the greens, there's kids in South Africa that chip them all, cross-handed like this, which I think is a great technique, especially for that bump and run.
There's a question about Bermuda. What do you do in Bermuda into the grain, either green side or 20 or 30 yards?
Well, there are a couple different techniques, depending on how that ball sits in the grass, whether it's buried down to the bottom or whether it's sort of sitting halfway up. And sometimes it's difficult to tell. You're kind of putting the wedge in behind the ball there. So generally the technique there would be into the grain. Speed matters. So usually you're going to up your speed a little bit. I remember Tom Watson used to say that anytime he was into the grain, he would automatically add 25% power. So in his mind, he would think that the hole was another 25% away from him. And that's the power that he would put into this, because no matter what happens as that club hits the grain, it's going to want to slow down a little bit. Now, one of the other things that you can do around shorter shots into the grain that I've seen some success is actually to work the club into a lot of supination. So open the face a little bit, but work it very shallow around the knees with a lot of supination, and kind of get the toe sort of passing the heel, almost like you're playing like an open faced, but you're trying to hook it type of a shot. And that tends to sort of slide the toe through. And I've seen some really nice sort of high, soft shots around the greens with that type of a technique.
All right.